So we are diving into making the foundation bustle skirt, also called an underskirt. It is sort of a continuation of the petticoat experience. And as we were talking about on Sunday, when you are making bustle dresses, typically they are made in separate garments, and all of the garments together create the dress. It's very rare that you have the bodice attached to the skirt so that you have a single frock. Part of this is deeply practical. The widths of fabric were not as wide as we are used to now. If you are able to make your bodice separate from your skirt, you can have extra bodices to do a morning look, an afternoon look, an evening look. And the skirts are what take up the most fabric and often the most time to create. So if you can reuse the skirts to create different looks, it's very helpful. So historically, it's very clever, it's a very practical approach, and it also makes it easier to pack things. Just in my lived experience from going to conventions with all these big frocks, if they were a single piece, I am not sure how I would pack them effectively in modern luggage. So I'm really glad that they come apart and that you can layer them, and that the really frothy overskirts are separate so that you can take them off and like bundle them separately into your luggage. So all of this is a very practical in that degree. It's also very helpful in terms of cleaning things. So typically, you are not cleaning these outer dresses on a regular basis. They're not really meant to be thrown in a modern washer. You could set them up in that way, that you make it in such a way that you could throw it in a modern washer, but you'd have to really think about your trim and be very careful with how you trim it. But most of them are meant to be cleaned only periodically, and everything underneath is what is getting cleaned. But if things are separate, then you may only need to clean the foundation skirt, and you might be able to get away with almost never cleaning your overskirt. So you can put a lot of really intricate trim on that piece of your garment so that it's something you can only dry clean. And if you have to take a road trip to Phoenix, because that is the closest dry cleaner that can clean your garments, it's a lot easier if you don't have to do that every time you go to a con. Ask me how I know. So there used to be a dry cleaner in Tucson that could handle my frocks. They closed in February of 2020. How handy. And so yeah, the closest good place is Phoenix. The next closest place is LA. That's a really long road trip to get things cleaned. So I will talk more about cleaning your garments as we are going through the class, but cleaning is really something to consider and where you're going to be wearing it. So for instance, when you are making your design and starting to plan out your trim, think about, am I wearing this to old Tucson studios in March when it's almost 100 degrees and there are tumbleweeds? Should I wear a train there? The answer is don't do that. That's a bad plan. Again, ask me how I know. So, Cindy says they have a green dry cleaner where she lives who can handle most things and no horrible smell. That's amazing. That's so good. But again, a bit of a trek. So this is my very much heavily used pattern from Truly Victorian. This is the TV 261 1885 4 gore underskirt. I love this pattern. I can make it work with early bustle. I can make it work with late bustle. It's very flexible pattern. And every time I make this skirt up, it looks different. It's all about the trim and the fabric and how you layer things together. So even though this is a very plain Jane looking pattern, it's like having that master sourdough starter pattern or recipe where you can make a million different loaves of bread. You can do the same with the skirt. That said, I'll be honest, I have no idea where my instructions are for this. I've made it so many times. I no longer review the instructions. So if you have questions about anything specific in the instructions, I may ask you to read me that section, but I will have my approach to finishing and putting it together that's sort of honed after a decade of using this pattern. Typically, I just cut it out at the largest possible size. And this is because I sometimes make things for my friends, and I want to maintain as much of the integrity of the pattern as possible. It's also because I learned a lot of mistakes making this pattern into a skirt originally. The first couple of times I made it, I cut the pattern apart. I did my adjustments directly on the pattern piece. You can absolutely do that. But these days, when I'm adjusting something a lot, I tend to make a new pattern piece rather than doing my adjustments directly on the pattern piece. But you're going to see some of the adjustments I've made, and I'm going to talk about some of those things and why I made those choices. This is so long, y'all. I'm 5'3". I'm long-waisted, and I have short legs. And this just goes for days and days and days. If I don't shorten it, the pattern piece from the floor to my body is almost nipple height for me. So I always have to shorten this at least somewhat. I will lay this flat so you can see it better, but you'll also see that there are a bunch of like lines traced in to my pattern. Those are all places where I marked where I was going to put trim directly on the pattern. Again, this is stuff I don't advise doing now, but it is something I used to do. These days, I make a master pattern out of like vellum or Swedish tracing paper, or I also will make my masters for this out of muslin. What we're going to be doing today is probably using muslin to create the master. And for me, that's sort of practical. I know I'm going to be using it a lot. And if I'm adjusting it again, I might as well make something that's really going to last for me. So if you love a pattern, sometimes making pattern pieces out of fabric that's pretty sturdy can behoove you. I do like the Swedish tracing paper for this. I don't think I have enough Swedish tracing paper to make pattern pieces of this size, so I'm going to rely on muslin. When I'm shortening something like this, rather than shorten from the hem, which will lose me the volume of the hem, which I absolutely want to maintain. I want it to maintain that kind of diameter at the bottom. So I get a nice silhouette to my skirt. And I have plenty of room for my trim and to go over my bustle. I will either shorten from the waist and just knock off that waist and add more darts to fit it into my waistband, or I'll shorten from the middle of the garment. However, you can shorten from the hem. If you're like, I don't really want it to be that full, I want it to be a little bit more of a narrow silhouette, I don't need as much hem space, you can easily just, this is the traditional shortening method for pencil skirts and, you know, very simple A-line skirts that do not have a lot of volume. You shorten from the hem. But if you've got like a swing skirt, fit and flare, a full circle skirt, any of these like wider skirts where you want to have wider hems, typically shortening from the hem is actually the opposite of what you want to do. So shortening from the waist is a very easy thing to do because you've got a nice little line you can just measure down from. But if you're like, no, this waist fits me perfectly, I don't want to mess with the waist measurement is great. But I'm like a hippie person. I've got a lot of badonkadonk. I made a really big bustle cage to go under this. Then shortening from the middle of your skirt panel can actually preserve the waist shape, the hem diameter, and create a little bit more volume in the body of the skirt. So there are some benefits to each of these methods. I'm going to show you both shortening from the waist and shortening from the body of the skirt. And then I will probably proceed with shortening from the waist because I honestly, I just add more darts. So, and we'll talk about that as we're going forward. Some other things to consider before you go in, you start making these adjustments. You want to think about, what am I doing with the hem? Do I want this to be a smooth, flat skirt all the way to the ground with no ruffle on the bottom, no pleats on the bottom, just like very tailored look? I'm going to do some sort of other trim situation with the skirt, or I just want it to be very tailored. So I've done all the things. I've gone from very tailored to very fussy, and I like it all. Sometimes you just have a vibe for your design. So if you have seen my beautiful blue, navy blue and light blue bustle dress from years and years ago, that that foundation skirt, it's this pattern. There's no trim on it. It's just a very solid skirt. And it looks beautiful. It's very sleek looking. And it has the most gorgeous hem on it I ever created. That hem is impeccable because there was nothing to hide the hem. But this is why trim is beautiful. You can machine hem the dickens out of it. Let me change my language there. And you get to cover it with trim. So no one ever knows that you just machine stitched your hem. You didn't go in and hand finish it. You still can. If you love hand finishing a hem, I will talk about hand finishing your hems so you have those skills. But I love being able to disguise my hem so I can do something faster. I think if I recall, the diameter on this hem is something like 80 to 120 inches. And so doing all of that by hand is a commitment to sitting in front of a lot of movies and drinking a lot of wine while I hand stitch for many hours. That's not the worst time, but what is my timeline? Do I have time to do that much hand sewing is often a question. So one of my favorite approaches to doing a deep pleat, which I love a deep pleat. You can see this gorgeous black pleat on my Star Trek skirt. And then I also did a beautiful deep pleat on this purple linen skirt. You can see the piping here is very clear because it's a nice red contrast. This is one of my little tips, tricks that I always use these days. I always put a band of piping at the top of my pleat, not just because it's attractive, but because it makes my ruffle, my pleats, very strong. And so when somebody steps on the hem of my skirt, because it will always happen, even if you don't have a train, somebody will always step on the hem. If I have that piping there, it reinforces the pleat and it is less likely that they will pull the ruffle or the pleat right off my skirt. So I love adding that piping just as a security method, security feature, as it were. But that's a bit of a tangent. But here's the thing with these pleats and these skirts, I did them differently. So this one, I knew I had like limited purple linen. And also I was like, I want it to be lighter weight and I don't have that much. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. My skirt stops right before the pleats start. So there's nothing under these pleats. They are just attached directly to the body of the skirt with the little piping there. I serged the edges to keep them clean. That's it. So it's kind of a very soft pleat. It's very lightweight. And that meant I could shorten the length of my skirt, not only by my normal measurement that I need to shorten it, but by the length of the pleat. So when I need to save fabric, sometimes that's what I do. I just shorten my skirt enough that it also takes into account the length of the pleat. This is oh gosh, let's see here. This is a 12-inch deep pleat. So that gave me many feet of fabric back to use for making the pleated ruffle. So that was really helpful for allowing me to expand my fabric. So if you are considering doing something where you don't have very much fabric, or you're trying to like conserve your budget, you may want to consider shortening your skirt and accounting for the amount of trim you're going to put, and just hang that trim off the body of the skirt. This is, however, very soft. These pleats are not supported. They are very soft. It's a more casual look. I love this skirt. I'm very happy with it, but I wanted something really tailored and strong for the Star Trek skirt because it's a uniform, because it's Starfleet. Because Starfleet is always very spick and span. I had a logic to my decisions. It was based off of a show that uses dilithium crystals, but it's fine. There was logic involved. So this one is made out of a wonderful cotton. It's a cotton sateen, which is a lot less expensive. And oh my gosh. Oh, I lied. I thought I'd supported. Oh my gosh. I'm gonna have to get one where I supported. Yeah, well, I pulled out the wrong example, so I'm going to be back in a minute. I finished this one exactly the same. Oh, that's such lies. So normally with something like this, I would take the skirt all the way to just above the edge of my pleats, so that they would have the skirt underneath them to support them, which gives them a little bit more structure and helps them have a little bit more body when you're moving around. So sometimes you want to support your pleats or your ruffles. And so having the fabric go all the way down to the hem and then mounting your trims on top of the fabric is a really good idea. So these are things to keep in mind as you're going forward. I'm like a little chagrined. I pulled out the wrong skirt to show you the alternative method. So I will probably get up and go get one that has fabric underneath the trim. But you can also see again, I have this is a tone on tone bit of piping. It's the same fabric. So you don't really see it in the same way you see that red piping against that purple fabric. Although visually it gives a really crisp line to where those pleats start on the skirt. And that's also another advantage of doing a row of piping. If all you're doing is a single layer of pleats or a single layer of ruffles, and you want to make sure that it's nice and crisp. So Cindy's question is a good one. Hold on, let me pull that up. So Cindy asked, how do I use my piping when I have not shortened the skirt underneath? That's a great question. So in that case, we'll probably see that happen because in the skirt I'm going to take the fabric all the way to the hem. But in that case, the piping is sort of sandwiched between the ruffle layer and the extended skirt layer. And so I sew it with the raw edge of the piping facing towards the hem edge. And when I pull down the ruffle, I get the same effect. Yeah. So I hope that sort of answers the question. Some of these things I feel like may sound hard to follow outside of the context of doing them, but the main reason I'm bringing up the trim at this point is so you can be thinking about how long do I want my skirt panels to be before I adjust this pattern and before I start cutting fabric, and how much trim do I want to put on my skirt? Or this is like, I'm just gonna make something very tailored and I might add trim later. I'm not going to worry about shortening the skirt or any of that business to worry about adding a ruffle. Those are all things you should be thinking about at this point as we're going into creating our pattern adjustments. So let me go grab the other skirt so I can at least show you what the alternative looks like. And you've got some ideas so you can keep that in your brain as you are preparing to go into these pattern adjustments. And also, please always do what Cindy and Martha and everybody stop, ask me questions, unmute yourself if I don't see your typed question. Do not let me be on a runaway train where you're like, I did not understand the last 5 minutes. I don't want to leave you behind. So be right back. So this is probably the most ridiculous, one of the most ridiculous hem treatments I've done. And you can see I've got a box pleat that is pieced. So the interior of the box pleat is a different color than the exterior. So when I walk, you get this pop of blue when it opens up. And then this is another box pleat on top of the box pleat. So you can't even see piping or anything like that because I've just got box pleats on top of box pleats. So this is actually how diverse your box pleats can look depending on the kinds of treatments you do to them. But this skirt weighs like 1,000,000 pounds. It's very hefty. It's flat lined, all the things. I did everything to this because it was going to be kind of an elaborate costume. And underneath the pleats, there is the body of the skirt. And this bit of fabric under here supports all of these pleats. You'll also see my pleats are flat lined in silk organza because this was such a fussy little bit of pleating with all the piecing and everything and this like fussy silk that I needed to really support it a lot in order to make my work survive essentially. So, but that's usually why I take the skirt all the way to the ground, is so that my beautiful hem treatment is really supported and has a nice or when I say to the ground, I mean the full length of the skirt. I normally hem my skirts so that they will finish on the top of my foot so that I'm not tripping over them. This one I made so that it sort of ends right around my ankle, just past my ankle. So it's one of my shorter dresses. But I really did not want to trip on this hem because it's so beautiful and I didn't want to have to ever put it back in. It's like a lot of work.
And it was so much work.
So much work. So much.
So my friend
yeah.
Karen tacks down the pleats at the bottom of the skirt. Do you ever do that? She
I
tacks
haven't.
to the supporting layer.
I
Yeah.
haven't, but that is,
She's insane. So,
yeah, I usually do not leave them. I leave them sort of loose. I know there are some dressmakers like
it's Karen McKechnie Lid that always
yes,
tacks
that's the
me.
one. You know the one. She
I do.
always tacks her
Her stuff
pleats.
is so beautiful.
Oh, yeah, it's so good. Well, she's getting an award in Italy for her stuff, so I guess it's working
Cool.
out for her. So
Yeah.
I'll try and remember to share a link to her work. It's really pristine, beautiful, super historical. She does not skip any steps. She invents steps that I never heard of. I'm like going to be more practical in my approach, if you will. So I do not do any sort of like tacking my pleats to that layer underneath, but I do use that layer to support the more fussy treatments. Now the dress, the skirt I'm going to be making while we're all working together is extremely fussy. I think it's going to make this one look like I was being lazy. I have terrible, ambitious plans. You'll see it at Wild West Con. That's how long it's going to take me to make it. So, and Sydney Joy has shared Karen's website. It's Lily Absinthe. It's beautiful eye candy. She makes beautiful things. So let's talk about, we're giving some thought to what is my approach? How much of my hem do I need? Am I going to just like add pleats to this? Am I going to leave it, extent? Am I going to make the base fabric the full length of my garment? Keep all these things in mind as you're adjusting, but also we need to make measurements. If you live alone, it's really hard to get your measurement from your waist to the floor, because as soon as you bend over to look at your tape measure, you change the length. So it's really hard to get that length. But yes, this is my secret weapon. This is a 6-foot long metal ruler that I got at Ace Hardware. This is imperfect, you all. I still am not going to get as easy or the best measurement I could without having an assistant. But as a person who lives alone, this will get me very close. And sadly, I don't have a good setup right now to show you what this looks like, but I'm gonna try not to poke a hole in my ceiling. I take this, I put it right next to my body with the bottom of the ruler on the ground, very parallel, and I can stand in front of a mirror and like just put my fingers where my waist is, and that will tell me that's your length from your waist to the floor. Once I know my length from the waist to the floor and I want my natural waist to the floor, then I can just hack off 2 inches from that, because I do not want my skirts to go all the way to the ground. So I know I want it to be a little bit shorter than going floor length. If you are going to be indoors, if you're doing a ball, if you are like going to swan about, you probably don't need to take a full 2 inches off. I would still not necessarily let it sweep the floor in the front, in front of your feet, because that's a tripping hazard. But if you are very agile and not worried about tripping and killing yourself, then go all the way to the ground. There's nothing wrong with that. But this is like $20 well spent at Ace. So, and it's metal, it will never go bad. I use it for a lot of really long pattern pieces when I need to make a really long adjustment as well. But it is 6 feet tall, so I have to store it separately. And if I'm not careful, I could ding my ceiling with it as I'm moving it around. So those are things to keep in mind. But this is my like secret weapon living alone. The other thing you can do if you don't have a friend to help measure you, or a partner, or a spouse, is that you can take a skirt where you like the length and you just measure the length of that skirt. So sometimes I look back at my various costumes and I'm like, you know what? I really liked the length of the Scarab Sunrise. That was a nice sassy length. You could see a little bit of my ankle. I want to live that slutty ankle life. I'm going to do my skirt that length. Or I'll be like, ooh, my traveling costume, that beautiful purple linen skirt, I got carried away. It is too long. It is just always dragging the floor, and I'm so worried I'm going to trip over myself. I do not want my skirt to be that long. Let me measure that, make sure I'm not going that long on my skirt. So I will measure the garments I know I like to wear them. The lengths are roughly right, and I will use those to be my guideline. Again, it's best if you can get someone to help measure you. It's very important when you are doing that, that you stand up nice and straight. Wear the shoes that you plan to wear with your frock or something equivalent. So you don't want to get your length measurement in platforms with a 3-inch heel if you're going to wear ballet flats, right? But if you're going to wear if you're not going to wear ballet flats and you want it to be really long, you need to put on that high heel or the shoe with a platform in it to make sure it will fall where you want it to be. The other trick when measuring is you want to stand up nice and straight, look forward at the person measuring you. Do not do this thing to be like, what are you doing? Are you doing a good job? You're going to have to trust your assistant to help measure you. And they should get you from your natural waist all the way to the point you want the skirt to fall, whether that's your ankle or the top of your foot or the floor. That's a personal decision. If you took my corset class, you know how to find your natural waist. But if you did not, I'm not wearing the best dress for this, but I'm very fortunate. I have a very obvious waist. But if you're like, I don't know where my natural waist is, you're going to just stand up straight again, bend to the side, find the place where your body makes a nice little fold, stand up. That is your natural waist. That is where you want to measure from to get your garment. That's also where you want to get your waist measurement. So you're not going to need a lot of measurements for this particular frock. You need your waist, you need your hips, and you need the length. And that is it. That's all you need. So 3 measurements is not too bad. If you're wearing a corset and you don't know your corseted waist measurement, I highly recommend taking your waist measurement for this over your corset. It's important to have that measurement going forward for these kinds of projects. Your hip, you can kind of just do your hip as you are, but if you're going to wear a lot of petticoats, if you're like, no, Madam, I have 5 petticoats I want to wear. I live that petticoat life. Put them all on and then get your waist measurement. But if you're like me and you wear like 1 petticoat, I'm wearing a dress that's lined. I'm taking up all the volume I need to. It's roughly the same. I don't recommend taking your measurements in a bulky sweater, in sweatpants, in like anything that's really thick and bulky, because that is going to distort your measurements. So if you want to take your measurements in clothing, wear something that's kind of mostly form-fitted, and or wear your corset and your underpinnings that you intend to put on under the frock. So any questions on measurements as we go into our pattern adjustments? This is where I get
I'll put my
winded.
bustle on first and then take the measurement for my hips.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely take it off with your bustle on. The nice thing about this, though, as fun as it is to like get your hip measurement with your bustle on, because it's like, you go from your
120
right,
no.
you're like, wow, wait, I don't know, is 120 inches enough in the hip? Maybe I need more. Maybe I need to pad that out. It is the bustle girl problem to have. But the lovely thing about this pattern, and as we are getting into the pattern adjustments, is that it has already taken into account that you're wearing a bustle under it. And in fact, if you don't wear a bustle under this, it's going to be limp and look a little weird in back, actually. And it's going to give you a train you did not intend to have. So sometimes we want a train. There's nothing wrong with the train life. There are some dangers with the train life, but there's nothing wrong with the train life. I love a train. I also go to a lot of conventions where people are like, "What's a train?" And then they walk on my train. And so I try not to do trains anymore for that reason. But I do love the way they look. Um, so fortunately, the pattern kind of already takes into account that you're going to be wearing a bustle and plans on it. But there is an adjustment you need to make if you are doing the lobster tail bustle. This actually came up during the lobster tail class, and it also we mentioned it a little bit on Sunday. You're going to need to lengthen your back panel a little bit to account for the greater volume of your bustle cage and like the sort of different shape. I love the shape of the lobster tail bustle so much. I've really essentially never gone back to any other bustle. Once I discovered that, I find it packs easily, it wears easily, it gives me a great shape. It's everything I want from a bustle. And it's pretty easy to make, so bonuses all the way around. But these patterns were originally not drafted to go over a lobster tail bustle because she created that pattern later. I don't know, she made it like 7 or 8 years ago, which is a while ago, but this company has been in business for a long time. And some of these patterns were like, this one was first drafted in 1997. So it's they've been around for a while. So yeah, when she first drafted it, it was made to go over this beautiful, ruffly bustle that is a very nice looking visually, but I find it is a little bit not pert enough. I want more volume in my bustle. I'd like it to be more emphatic. And so that one is just like a little softer, a little less prominent, doesn't protrude as much. So I don't make it. So I'm going to show you how to adjust this to go over the lobster tail bustle and the kinds of things you're going to want to do for that. And like I said, I tend to prefer to trim mine from the waist because I'm a very hippie girl. I want that hip volume. And also, I'm just going to take in darts at the waist to make it fit into my waistband. So I'm very happy with that adjustment. There are a couple of other things to consider. I know I'm giving you lots of things to consider before we even go into drawing and everything. But the back of the bustle skirt has an option to make it with poofs and without poofs. So let's look at the poofs. So you can see up here in the corner, you've got it sort of bustled up in the back and it creates these lovely poofy bits. And then you've got this version where it's just like pleats falling nice and straight and smooth to the bottom. This is usually the version I make without the poofs because I'm going to cover it with an overskirt and you won't see the poofs. So I don't feel a need to cut that additional fabric and to take that additional effort to create those. But if you want to do your foundation skirt without an overskirt, or if you want to just have the drapery in front and have the back of your skirt visible, then the poofs are a really beautiful visual feature, and I recommend them. The poofs can give you a little bit additional volume too. So if you're like, wow, I'm just like trying to build up more and more volume, you may wish to also put poofs in the back of your skirt. It's another thing to consider. Do I want those? Why do I want them? What are they going to service visually and functionally in my finished skirt? Again, you can also ask me, like you can come up with designs, share them. We can all give you some feedback on your designs. But if you're just like, I don't know, I want this and I'm not sure what to do, I will have some suggestions. Alicia says, yeah, no sad unbustled trains here. Very important. She did use the poofs for her green and cream outfit because at the time she didn't have a big enough bustle underneath. Yeah, so you can use the poofs to sort of give you a little bit more loft and give you a little bit more volume in the back of your skirt. If you're like, boy, I really want to emphasize or emphasis on my chassis, as it were. So think about your poofs, poofs or no poofs. This is again, mistakes I made in my youth. My terrible youth of like 35 or whatever. I wasn't that young, but I just totally cut that bit off entirely. These days, I would just trace out the pattern piece without the poofs rather than cutting it. So now whenever I want to add the poofs, I have to tape this pattern piece back on, and I just use Scotch tape to do that. It works out fine, but it is sort of like a pain in my tuchus. And it means that I'm constantly pulling the tape on and off, which will eventually damage the paper. So it's fine, but I use this pattern so much, I kind of wish I hadn't cut it apart as much as I did. So these are my little warnings to you and also things to think about. I am such a strumpet when it comes to my patterns and my adjustments and my dotation. I will write on everything. And this is a thing where I am going to be like, don't cut into your pattern. Be careful with how much you cut it. The cutting and taping will, have wear and tear. But I'm like, write all over it, write on everything. Writing doesn't matter. You can write over the writing. So you'll see that I've even like made a little diagram for myself inside the pattern to remind myself to add a little bit to the back of my back panel to accommodate for the lobster tail. And so my patterns will often have notations and little sketches like this.
So your 60-inch notation there is reminding me to ask you a question.
Yes.
My cotton is 45 inches wide.
Yeah.
Do I add the extra on the sides when I'm piecing, or I don't want to seam down the middle of that back?
Right. Let's talk about this a little bit. This is a great question. So this is, wait, this is a pattern piece for another pattern. But this is what you're, oh my gosh, I am such a strumpet. This is what you're getting into with Bustle, though, is pattern pieces that are longer than you are tall. This is from an overskirt that I really love, and I'll be super sad that it is not with the right pattern. So I'm going to set this aside. Oh my goodness. It looks a lot like the back of the back pattern piece, which is very, very large as well. Oh my gosh. I think I put this entire bustle skirt pattern in this envelope. Well, I'm glad I discovered that together with all of you. So this is the pattern piece for the back of your skirt, back panel. It's very long, but it's actually, it's 22 inches wide. And so Cindy to answer your question, and for everybody, if you have 45-inch wide fabric, you do not need to cut down the side of your skirt. You can just lay this on your panel of fabric along the fold to get the length and the shape of the hem for your skirt, the back panel. When I'm making mine, because I'm ridiculous and because I'm a large lady, I actually just tend to use 60-inch wide fabric, and then I go the full length of that back panel for the back of my skirt, because I have a lot of hip and I have a lot of tush and I want more volume in back. You don't have to do that. It's just that I'm dramatic and extra. And again, I'm a large lady, so I have the body to carry that off. But having 45 inches of fabric in a single panel in the back of your body is actually quite a bit of fabric. So you will still have a very full, luscious, bustle skirt by doing that. But if you're like, man, this cutting is really hard and these pieces are really big and I have 60-inch wide fabric and I don't want to end up with these weird like 15-inch remnants or 12-inch remnants on either side, you can make it as wide as I do. You can make this back panel pretty wide. It is fine. The wider you make it, the more dramatic it is. That's all. That's a personal preference. So, but great question, because the width of your fabric is going to determine some of the changes and some of the ways you cut your fabric. So right now we're mostly going to be looking at the pattern adjustments, but when we get into cutting our fabric, that's where it's going to be like, wow, do I have to adjust? Do I have to cut out these little bits? Can I cheat and make it wider because it's easier? Can I make it a little narrower? Is that feasible? This is a very forgiving pattern. There's a lot of ease in this pattern. So if you're like short an inch someplace, if you cannot quite get it wide enough, really you have enough ease that you can lose an inch in a panel and you'll be fine. I would say don't do that across the board because it will add up, but like an inch or two is fine to lose in width. Adding 15 inches is fine because you'll just bustle it up and it'll look more dramatic. So that's a lot more flexibility than you're going to get in mini skirt patterns where you need to really pay attention to the width of your panels. So it's nice to have something this forgiving. Oh my goodness.
Her
Okay.
notation on the yardage needed made me confuse me. But now I see how I read it. I skimmed it too fast. And the lengths are actually for 44, 45-inch wide fabric.
Mhm.
But if you have 60-inch wide fabric, then it's what the short one is. Because
Yes.
the layout makes it look like it's going to take the full width of the fabric. And she's asking for 60-inch wide fabric. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
So reading
yes,
comprehension is important.
it is, but also you don't have to piece. That is the good news because
Yeah,
you're right. In general, you do not want to seam down the center back of your
I
bustle
don't.
skirt. It will be obvious. And also, even with an overskirt, it will show. But also, that is a stress point in your garment, where you're like actually using the center of the garment to do some bustling and some holding of the garment. And so you kind of don't want to seam there. You can bury seams if you do need to piece your fabric for whatever reason, because you're using fabric from your stash, because you're using vintage fabric, because you made a cutting mistake and you don't want to start from the start and you can't afford to buy new fabric. There are lots of reasons why you might need to piece. If you need to piece, I recommend actually adding to the sides and burying those seams in the side of the panel and then disguising them inside your pleats, because that whole back panel gets pleated into the waistband or gathered into the waistband. I normally do pleats because I like them, But you can hide those seams inside a pleat. It's really hard to hide a center back seam, but it's pretty easy to hide side seams. So if you're gonna piece, I would piece that large panel by extending from the sides. Okay. My goodness, I'm gonna get a pattern piece that's a little bit easier to work with to start. And so we're going to look at our center front panel and how we're going to adjust that. Again, very much like with our bustle cage, you are going to discover I never use the waistband pattern. It's a rectangle. I just use my ruler and I make the size rectangle I want for my personal waistband. So she likes to make her waistbands 4 inches wide, and I normally do as well. But sometimes I've got a really heavy skirt and I want a wider waistband to help hold all the weight of the skirt. Sometimes I am like, oh, this fabric is really thick, and having a wide waistband is going to create more bulk in more places than I want. I'm going to do a narrower waistband. So it varies by garment, but typically I'm just going to take my own personal measurements to make the waistband. I will show you how to make a waistband when we get to waistband time. So let's look at making adjustments in our center front piece. I'm going to take you in to the top-down view, and we're going to look at some measurements and some really quick, easy ways to adjust. I'm also moving my water bottle so I don't douse the pattern piece while we're working, because that would really suck for me. Okay. Please let me know if at any time you can no longer see what I'm doing in the screen, or I move out of the screen when I'm talking. Okay, there we go. So you may or may not see, I have all these pencil marks on my pattern piece. That is because when I was first starting out, I just made my adjustments directly to the pattern piece rather than creating a new piece. But these days I like to trace a new pattern piece so that I preserve the paper for future projects. The pattern piece for this skirt is so long. It's 42 inches long, approximately 42, 44, something like that. So it's pretty long. It means I need a good table space to work on. You can see, maybe you can see at one point I cut it and I had to tape it back together again. That was for doing some very long pleats at one point. But typically I'm going to just go into the top here and measure down from the top edge to find how much I want to shorten it. Keep in mind when you're shortening that you're going to lose a 1/2 inch for the seam allowance at the top. So keep that number in mind. And then you're going to lose at least 1 inch, but maybe 1.5 inches from the bottom for the hem. So you want to consider, how am I going to hem this? Am I going to just fold it over and fold it over again, a 1/2 inch at a time, machine stitch it? Bob's my uncle. Then I need to keep 1 inch in mind. Am I going to do a hand finished hem then you want to keep that 1.5 inch measurement in mind. And always go in, confirm, confirm, confirm. Your lengths is 42 inches long, center front. I know that I would like mine to be 39 inches finished, which is not too bad. Or rather, I want to get it to 39 inches at this juncture. So I'm going to take off about 2 inches from my garment here at the top. Just to shorten it enough. And I'm going to continue that subtraction across my panels. So if I were doing this from the top, past Jocelyn was like, I'm doing 2.5 inches shorter. I just said I wanted to get mine to 39 inches. So 42 minus 39 is really 3 inches. And I think past Jocelyn was like, ooh, that 1/2 inch is for security. But typically what I do is I can just come in here with my little pencil or erasable pen, and I can make a mark here if I'm going to make my adjustments directly on the pattern. And then I can.
Your hand and pen are above the frame.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Good.
A little bit more.
A little bit more. Thank you, Cindy. Is it in the frame?
2 inches more. You were like way out. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, good. Oh my gosh. So glad. So I just can go in with my ruler, line my ruler edge up here with the top, and like draw in a little line here. If I'm doing my adjustments directly to the panel, and then fold it out of the way, and suddenly the length is adjusted. That's all I have to do if I'm adjusting it from the waist. But if you're like, ooh, that waist is perfect for me. I love that waist. I don't want anything to happen to that waist. It's perfect, perfect, perfect. I love the shape over here in the hip. Everything fits really nice, but I'm very short. I need to shorten in the body of my skirt. This is why I have all of these lines in parts. Some of them are for adding trim, but some of them are for shortening in the body of my pattern. Find a spot that's sort of midway down your pattern. Halfway-ish. You don't have to pull out, a plumb bob or anything like that to find the perfect halfway mark, but you want to get visually halfway down your skirt. Draw a line. And then you want to this is a good place to use erasable stuff. You want to make a second line that is roughly half the amount you want to take off your skirt. So this is my fold line. Going to change my orientation a bit here. Here's my fold line that I traced in. I'm going to fold my pattern right along that line. And then I'm going to fold it up to the line of adjustment. And when I do that, I've taken my skirt up 3 inches, or my trousers, or my tunic, or my dress. I can do this to any garment where I need to take out some length. I just sort of pleat the pattern paper up like so. Give it a nice, good, crisp fold. And now I've shortened the garment, the amount I need to shorten it. But you can see, I hope you can see, over here. Now the skirt, the bottom here, there's a little like divot that sticks out, right? So we're going to need to adjust the side by grading in the side so that this side seam becomes one continuous line now. So let me go get my muslin so I can show you how that works. I love muslin. I like to keep some in the workshop pretty much at all times. It's such a wonderful fabric for mocking things up, for linings, for all sorts of stuff. It's a good cotton fabric, very stable, a wonderful utility fabric. I typically these days, just whenever I order from Mood Fabrics, um, they have a deal where if you are ordering something from them, they will sell you 5 yards of muslin for like $3 a yard, $2 a yard. It's a good deal. And it's like a nice quality 100% cotton muslin. And so normally I just buy 5 yards every time I place a Mood order. Now, a good seamstress, a good sewist would make sure this is all pressed and ready to go. No wrinkles in it. I'm being a bad sewist right now for the purposes of this demo. I did not pre-press my fabric. I only need a single layer of muslin because I am just making a pattern piece. And I'm short, so I can actually use the width of my fabric rather than the length of my fabric. If you're a tall person, you're going to need the length of the fabric. Now, honestly, before I finalize a pattern made out of muslin, I am going to press this yardage to make sure it's nice and smooth and I don't have weird wrinkles in it. But I can demonstrate for you how I would make my adjustment here on this side seam. And that's what I want to make sure you can see. You sort of see I'm focused in. Yeah, good. All right. This is a great place to pull out those pattern weights. When I'm using pattern weights on a long or wide or big pattern piece like this, I usually start in the middle and I work out so that I make sure my pattern piece is nice and smooth on my fabric. If your pattern piece is really mangled, I recommend pressing your pattern piece as well as your fabric. And you'll see that I sort of drop the pattern weight onto my pattern piece and then I slide it to the edges. That helps work out any air pockets or anything that's hanging out, making it inaccurate. Now, typically, when I'm doing stuff like this, I am not working with Sharpie. I'm working with a pencil or a Frixion pen or something I can remove. Sometimes in class, I use a Sharpie so that you can see what I'm doing, because I know that the fine line of the Frixion, even in a dark ink, is not something you can see well. But I don't actually recommend using Sharpie for this sort of thing, because you're going to invariably you will do something where you're like, oh, that's not quite what I wanted. And now you have to like scratch out the lines. So I've got my wonderful ruler here. This is my clear ruler, gridded for corset making. And they're great for making adjustments like this, I'm going to bring my ruler along the edge and line it up with the edge here where I've got my little divot. And then I'm just going to sort of pivot it in until the edge of the ruler lines up and disappears into my pattern. And I'm going to trace along there. And now you can see I've extended that bit of empty space into a complete line. So when I go along and trace the rest of my pattern, it is complete. A nice smooth line, no dog leg, no weird divot. And so with that, my adjustment is complete for this skirt. I've adjusted it for length. I'm not worried about adjusting the darts yet. That's something I will adjust when I am going in to put the finishing touches on the panel once I flatlined it, once I've picked out my fabric and everything. If you are concerned about your adjustments, you can always mock up your four-gore underskirt just in muslin. Take your muslin pattern pieces, use them to sew up the shape. Make sure you like the length, the width, how it drapes. I usually don't mock these up. I rarely mock up skirts unless there's something really fussy happening with them, because I find them very forgiving. But I also find that it's really easy to adjust my darts. And I think that dart adjustments are one of those things that sound complicated, but are actually a pretty easy process. So we will be doing some dart adjustments as we go along. If you are sort of feeling more persnickety, you can always trace in your darts as a guideline for your finished skirt. But keep in mind, pretty much always, everyone needs to adjust their darts for their body. Darts are always meant to be shifted, adjusted. They are places where the pattern maker is telling you, here's a spot where you can adjust the fit. You can take this waist in more if you want to by using a different shaped dart, more darts, etc., etc. So this is our very simple adjustment on the front panel. You do the same kind of adjustment on the two side panels that go with this. So the four-gore skirt has a single front panel, two side panels, that makes 3 panels, and then the big, broad, wide back panel. So I'm not going to show you the adjustment on the side panels because it's exactly the same as adjusting the front panel, but I do want to look at that back panel because it has a couple of fussy adjustments. I'm also going to take a moment, drink some water as I am shifting things and answer any questions before we get into that back panel. And also look at your beautiful faces. I like to see all of you and how you're doing. So, any questions about the adjustments so far? Good.
So I guess it doesn't make much of a difference on this skirt, but I was always taught to even out the seams just from end to end and not to go to
The center.
dogleg part. What?
Oh, or
So
not.
it would be like a straight line from the waist to the hem.
Yeah, well, honestly,
I think it just must
it
not matter much on this one because
no, and
so much
honestly,
fabric.
so it's a lot of fabric, but also, yes, it's a good idea to make sure that that adjustment is pretty plumb. Hold on. But as you can see, I go this little bit right. Well, I don't know if you can see that. Okay, yes.
Yeah, I
This
can
little
see
bit
it.
right here, it curves. There's
Right.
a little curve from about the little notch to the waist. So I sort of,
Ah, you're cheating it out. Okay. I
from
see.
under the curve into the straight line. And then I make sure it's straight into the rest of the seam. So the whole thing is nice and straight. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't want to, if I haven't shortened from my waistband and I'm doing this adjustment, I want to go ahead and preserve that curve. If it's there, I might as well preserve it. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? It's a good question. And
Yeah.
it's, yeah, I breezed right by that. So,
Yeah. And it would still be like from the dart to the hem, but yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
also, frankly, it's an incredibly forgiving pattern in the way that like a pencil skirt or a mermaid skirt or anything that's like more fitted through the body is not as forgiving.
Mm.
So one of the reasons I love this is it's so uh it allows you to like learn on the job in a way where you can still have a beautiful finished garment, even if you're like figuring things out as you go.
So as long as you have a relatively straight line from that dart to the hem, it's
You're
gonna.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good question. Thank you, Cindy.
Mhm.
Um, Cindy always asks the questions that keep me honest. I really appreciate that. You never let me like breeze by things too hard. Thank you. And I mean that
I'm not
sincerely. I'm
shy
not
about
being,
asking questions, and I know other people are gonna have them, so I just,
yeah, thank you.
yeah.
I'm never supercilious. I do really appreciate the questions because they are very helpful. Okay. So water. So the big panel in the back, the biggest adjustment, you've got to adjust it for the length. If you adjust any of the other panels for length, you also need to shorten that big back panel. But then you're going to lengthen it as well in a particular spot. So you're not making the whole thing longer. You're just kind of changing the shape of the bottom edge of that panel. So we're going to look at doing that. I'm going to shorten every panel by the same amount. So my amount that I'm shortening is 3 inches across the board. So every panel, I'm going to hack off that 3 inches, either at the body of the skirt, as I just demonstrated, or from the waistband, which is like a little bit of an easier adjustment.
Do you
But
do it the same on each piece? Like you did it from the middle. So
yeah.
on each piece, it'll be from the middle.
Yes. So usually if I choose, except for the back panel, usually if I choose to shorten from the middle, I do that on both the center front and the side panels. If I choose to shorten from the waistband, then I do that to the center front and the side panels. The reason why it's different for the back panel is it's basically a rectangle. So it's the same at the top as in the middle. The only shaping on that panel is at the hem. That's it. So it's the same, exactly the same, adjusting it from middle or top, because you're just shortening a rectangle. But adjusting the hem dimension, adjusting the hem shape is the sort of tricky one. So this is a pattern piece. This is not my finished garment. So I'm going to like be a little abusive to a small section of muslin because I don't want to reuse a bunch of muslin for demonstrating how to make this adjustment. But normally I would not like lay my pattern piece back down exactly on the place where I just did an adjustment for another pattern piece. I didn't finish adjusting it. This has not been pressed. I don't want to use this unpressed for my pattern piece. So we're just doing these markings right now so I can demonstrate for you what they look like. Oh my gosh. So I know we talked about this a little bit in the corset class. I think we probably mentioned it a bit in the bustle cage class, but we talked about it more in the corset class. Something that's good to add to your arsenal of sewing tools is some sort of curved ruler, whether it's a French curve or, a hip curve or what have you. Sometimes you need a curve, and it's great to have a standardly curved line that was engineered for curves to help you out. There are ways to work around that, but it's always nice to have a curve. Adjusting the hem of this particular skirt in the back panel area, it's really nice to have a curve. So I'm going to be using my friendly curve. I'm not going to show you how to adjust the length of this because it's just like you would do for the front two panels. You can fold down from the top, you can fold into the center. That's simple. But adjusting the hem is the one where it's a little bit tricky. This is something that Joanne brought up during our bustle cage class, where she was like, oh, hey, don't you need to adjust the back of this skirt to wear over your lobster tail bustle? Yes, it is not mentioned in the skirt pattern envelope, or at least not on my printing. But if you are making that lobster tail bustle, she mentions it in that pattern. Oh, by the way, if you're making the four-gore skirt or any of these other underskirts, you're going to need to make this adjustment in the back of the skirt. So I like to have my handy dandy grid ruler. I like to have something with a curve to it. And I always like to have my little seam gauge friend. This is a very powerful little tool to have. I usually have a few curves around because I'm obsessed with curvy things. It's probably because of my essential nature. I love curves. So let's take a look here. All right, so you can see the hem here. So this is the center midpoint of the hem to the edge here. This is about, this is for a 22-inch wide panel. If you're doing a wider thing like I do, you're going to have to sort of smooth out the curve a little bit on your wider fabric. But if you're just doing it as drafted, you want to add 6 to 8 inches here in the back. I usually do 6, and I find that that is sufficient. If you have more padding, if you've added more loft over the top of your lobster tail bustle, you're probably going to need to go up to 8 inches to add to the back here. You just want to take your ruler, line it up with the center line here. Get it nice and straight. You want to make a little mark here, the 6-inch adjustment. Okay, so that's our end goal. We want to get to that 6 inches. If you don't have a curve to help you out, you can kind of just scoot your ruler along, and every 1.5 to 2 inches, you're going to go up a smidge, like a 1/2 inch or so, and make a little hash mark. Give yourself a little dotted line here. The goal is to take this curve and work it into your side seam here. This is how you do it if you don't have a French curve, a hip curve, what have you. Oops. This is how I did it for years before I convinced myself that I was allowed to spend the $10 on a curved ruler. And it works, y'all. But also, curved rulers are not that expensive, and you are worth it to have the tools. So you're gonna make this curve here, and you want to like connect your dots to create this new curve that is much deeper along the center back seam. This is to account for the greater volume and the more dramatic shape of the lobster tail. When you're doing this, make sure you go in and you extend the line from your pattern piece. So you still have that nice straight seam or straight line for lining it up on the folds, center back folds. And then you're just going to like connect the dots on your lines. So until you get roughly into the side seam. I did not make my curve steep enough because I'm about 1.5 inches too long over there. So you may have to zhuzh that a little bit. But if you use a nice curved ruler, you can just line it up with your hash mark and follow the curve and like move your curved ruler along. So this should be like the new shape of the back hem of your central pattern. And that's how you're going to trace that in to the side seam. So it's a fairly easy adjustment. You'll see that my grading by hand was almost right, but I kind of didn't scale it up, the curve up enough when I was getting towards the side seam. So you can eyeball this. You can use your little seam gauge very effectively. You can also use your beautiful grid ruler to get this change and just do the little hash marks if you don't have a curve. But you can see it was like a lot quicker to use the curve ruler to do that than to slowly go along and like eyeball the grade of that curve into my side seam. So any questions about adjusting that back panel or the length overall of your panels? Okay.
So do you ever, so you want it to be 6 inches longer at the center back, but
Yes.
you've got, that's on a fold, so you don't have to worry about a seam allowance at the center back.
You
But
do
you have
not.
to worry about the seam allowance on the side? 'Cause
No,
you
not
don't
really,
worry about
because
it?
you're just working it back into that curve. And so even in the original pattern, it doesn't like flatten out there to like accommodate for the side seam. She just has the curve go the entire length of that bottom edge. So I just sort of mimic her existing curve there. You'll see that there's some like funny ways about how the panels go together at the back. And of course, you're also covering it typically with trim, so that helps as well. But so what Cindy is asking is, let's see, let me demo what this looks like a little bit. So the question Cindy's asking, I think, is a little bit easier to show and to talk about. Can you see that side seam? Okay, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good. Boy, get this to stay stable. So when you go in here to sew this, all these seams are 1/2 inch wide seams. So this 1/2 inch here is going into my seam allowance. And when I fold it over, there's a potential that it's not going to line up nicely with the under edge of my hem. See how it's sort of like offset from the hem? she's sort of expecting you to like fold this up, put a hem facing into it, and sort of like ignore that little dog leg that's happening there. But if you want to avoid that dog leg, you go across from that sort of, you're going to bring your curve up to that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to make a straight line straight across. So it looks more like this. So that when you fold it under, you don't get the same dog leg. It's going to be more flush. Or you can even make a little diamond shape there so it lines up very smoothly with the curve.
I was more concerned with the vertical because you don't have that curve on the side panels, right?
No, you do not. They
So
meet up
when,
flush. They're flush. And
yeah,
they
but then
don't
you've made that seam longer.
yeah, it basically
I
it's
know
not
I'm not gigantic, but I'm like
yeah.
crazy with my patterns.
No, well, I mean, you are detail oriented.
Right.
Honestly, the side seam, see if I can find that panel. Okay. So the side panel is like straight at the bottom, Cindy. So it kind of meets up in this slightly awkward way here at the join. It's
Yeah,
not even curved.
I think this is one of the things that bugs me about Heather's patterns.
That's fair. That is fair. So what you can do, of course, is to continue the curve into the bottom edge of this panel. And if you have the skills and the know-how, that is a perfect like adjustment to make. I remember when I was first introduced to the panel, the person or this pattern, the person actually had us like leave this longer than the side panel and fold it up like so to meet the side panel, and that drives me crazy. So I don't do that. I just sort of smooth out the hem as I'm putting it in. So
Yeah, I would lengthen the side panel. In like a little bit of a wedge
it'll
towards,
yeah,
yeah, just to
to
make
make
it like if you could see where I was putting my pointer on my computer.
right. Yes. So that is something you could do. You could definitely like, well, Wendy is, I don't know why I'm calling you Wendy tonight, Cindy. So I apologize. Um,
Maybe
so
I'm being
let's,
a Wendy. I don't know. Is that kind of
I
like the
don't know.
Karen of pattern making?
Oh my God, no, girl, no. But I think that maybe I'm having some weird, like it's hot and my brain has decided to make names hard. So we've got a lot of lines here now. I apologize. And Cindy, can you see this okay, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, so I've got this little side seam of my side panel that's going to mesh up with my back panel side. And if I want to do this little adjustment, stop me if this is not what you had in mind, Cindy, but you're gonna sort of like grade out the edge of your skirt to have a little wedge here. At the bottom. so that now this adjustment will match up with the adjustment of the back edge, and you'll have a more smooth transition between your hems. If you want to like be a little fancy, you can come in and make that a bit of a curved wedge instead of the straight on wedge, and use your curved ruler to add in a bit of a curve there so that your hem becomes a little bit more curved as it goes into the back panel. That is probably nicer looking. But honestly, I haven't had any problems just using it as it is. That's more of a, I don't want to say finicky. I just think that's a more nice detail to be concerned about.
Yeah, and it all depends on how it goes over the bustle too. And,
Yeah.
trains get wonky because of where you want the length to be. But
Yes.
this isn't really a train. This is an adjustment for our centaur butts. So
It's an adjustment for our centaur butts. It's an important adjustment. We want our centaurs to be beautifully covered,
yeah.
and have plenty of fabric over them. And we don't want our petticoats to show and all of that. And I think there will be a point in this construction where we're going to get to a panel. I'm like, yeah, that one never lines up. It's always a little bit wonky. And that is what Cindy is talking about right now, is like adjusting for that wonkiness before we get into the construction. But it's the kind of wonky where I'm just like, well, it's going into the hem, it's getting covered by ruffles. It makes me sound very lackadaisical.
Yeah, I
But
think the ruffles and the pleats help a lot with the
they
not
they
worrying
do.
about the wonkiness at the bottom of the skirt, because you're
Yeah.
giving yourself a level line there with the
Yes, yes, which is very important. And when I do the skirts, like I showed you on the black skirt and the purple skirt, you know, I'm cutting the hem off entirely by like 12 inches. And so everything gets very flattened, very straight, and gets sort of matched up in a better way. And then I add this ruffle onto the bottom, and is like, first of all, the ruffle, it does provide a level line, but it moves a lot. So there's a little bit of like, your eye can't even tell to a certain degree. If it's off a 16th of an inch or an eighth of an inch, it sort of gets lost in the movement of the fabric. So that's
like
kind of,
camouflage.
yeah, it is a little bit of camouflage that helps. So yeah, there are things about the way that these pattern pieces line up. I that any pattern pieces line up that sometimes you're going to be like, that's a little wonky. How can I sort of zhuzh this or camouflage this or sort of smush it into working? Oh my gosh. So Alicia says she's such a chaos demon that she tends to cut things a little bit long and then adjust them once the side seams are sewn together. That's also, frankly, cut everything a ½ inch long, and then you can like just trim that ½ inch off and make sure everything lines up properly. We'll talk about this when we get into the construction, but I normally sew from the waist down to the hem, and I get my waist all level, and then I will sort of smooth out any weirdness in the hem before I finish it and cover it in trim. So I'm not quite approaching Alicia's level of chaos, but there is an element of bisexual chaos in everything I do, and it's Pride Month, and so I'm just going to own that I'm a little bit of a chaos gremlin about some things. As much as I'm like very particular about like, when you're making corsets, you need everything to be just so, and like be very thoughtful about your measurements. When I get into something like this, I'm like, well, it's not a corset. Like, you've got so much more leeway. It's fine. You can like zhuzh it until it works. I think it's interesting that both of those attitudes exist. and that it varies in me and it varies by the project. So I am like, when it comes to hat making and corset making, I'm like, ooh, be very, very careful with your tracing and your cutting and your measurements and making sure that things line up pretty well. But with the skirts, I'm just like, yeah, no, when we come to the hem, we can always clean it up a little bit. It'll be fine. I basically always make this one. I have made the Parisian skirt before. I love that one, everyone, but it is
That's a
like,
lot of skirts.
it's a lot of skirts, and
It's very pretty.
it's beautiful. Oh, did I pull that pattern up here? Yes. What is going on? So I've only made it the once because I was really unhappy with the sort of droopiness of the lower pleats. But it's very fussy and it uses a lot of fabric, wildly more than this skirt. And so I just don't go back to it, even though it's beautiful looking. If you remember the Crimson Dragon ensemble, that skirt is the Parisian skirt, and I mean, I can notice the droopy pleats. I don't know if anyone else is like, look at those droopy pleats. We can't believe you have those droopy pleats. But I made it. So I'm like, I noticed the droopy pleats. So
Is that your red cotton?
no, it's the red, it's like a red rayon skirt with a bright turquoise ruffle, and then the bodice is like this crimson red silk brocade that has a dragon pattern on it. I haven't worn it in years because it is.
I don't think I've seen it because you don't like the way the swags work. So
Well, that's not the reason I don't wear it anymore.
Oh.
It doesn't fit. It is too small, and it was extremely vain costume. I made that probably like 7 years ago or 8 years ago. It's an old one. But also, yeah, I mean, I still wore it even though the swags bothered me because it was so hard to make.
It's a
But
lot of
yeah,
layers in like one skirt. I've looked at the pattern and yeah, and
yeah.
I don't remember how she puts it together, but it all winds up being one skirt that you put on all together.
Yeah, it
Right?
is. So it looks like it's,
But it looks
multiple.
like it's like 4 different pieces.
Yeah, and it's one skirt. Um, no, Alicia, it wasn't the fabric body or like the base, because I've seen multiple people make this skirt and everybody's pleats at the bottom are like extra droopy. And I think it's just the way she drafted the pleat. It has like too much curve in it. Yeah. So it just needs to be like a little tauter. Well, I want a taut pleat, I guess. I don't know.
It,
I wish I could find the pattern since I pulled it out and it's like somehow disappeared in the last 2 hours. But it's
yeah, my
fine.
guess would be that the edges need to come in
Yeah,
of that panel.
yeah.
But
So
it just
it's
it's annoying when you put that much work in and you're like, I wanted it to be perfect.
right. And then you're like, why is this so droopy? And it's also one of those things where it wasn't super noticeable until I put it on, and then gravity took effect, and I was like, huh. The other thing about it that I found sort of personally challenging was, of course, I did not use my beautiful rayon fabric under where those front swags were. I used a red cotton underneath them to save money. And so when I got done with it, you were supposed to be able to just like have a ruffle underneath where the swags ended, and the placement of the ruffle was not did not marry up all the way under the swag the way she had it drafted. And so I had to later go back in and add a second ruffle after I'd added the swags and everything else. And I was like, this is so irksome. It was a very
It's a nightmare.
Yeah, it was kind of a nightmare. But it's a beautiful skirt. It's not one I would recommend starting with, uh, for all of the reasons I just listed. It's kind of fussy, and there are these things about it where I'm like, there needs to be more adjustment when you're going in and making it. So it's not a good starting point, but it's a beautiful one to build up to. And this pattern and doing the overskirt and all of that will give you the skills to build up to doing that pattern. And there's no reason, just because I had a sort of bad time with it, there's no reason why you can't have a great time with that pattern. Those are very personal experiences.
And I like
Yeah.
the side pieces on the skirt that like tie in between the bustle and the swags
Yeah,
in the front.
it's
And
so cool.
they remind me of the brown dress with the scallops on it in the embellishments book.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you see that treatment on a few fashion plates and dresses from the 19th century, and it's really fun, interesting. It looks like you've got this additional layer of fabric, and it's just part of a single skirt. And it's
And I
a
hadn't thought
wonderful.
about that, no, about her skirt in a while, but that is something that I'm developing a pattern now where that's part of the pattern is
Ooh, cool,
it's got the
cool.
side bits on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Joanne, I'm also happy to blame Cake. I actually think that the odds are in favor that Cake knocked it off onto the floor, and I just can't see it without getting up and moving around and moving a bunch of stuff. He has been feeling very frisky. So, all right. So, this is us for tonight, everybody. This was like the pattern adjustments I wanted to go over with you. On Sunday, we're going to look at cutting our fabric, and we're going to talk more about design. So one of the things I'm going to be showing you with this is the ways in which I save money on fabric and how I make my silk go further when I'm doing a big silk project.